In the heart of medieval Europe, while the Catholic Church erected its majestic cathedrals and preached chastity as the supreme virtue, a Christian sect practiced something that today seems impossible to conceive. In villages hidden among mountains and dense forests, men and women gathered in secret ceremonies where the sacred and the carnal merged in ways that defy our modern understanding. They believed they were fulfilling the divine will through acts that the official church considered the most abominable sins. This is not an urban legend or historical fantasy. It is a real and disturbing chapter in the history of Christianity that was deliberately erased from official records. The Carpocratians, as they became known, emerged in the 2nd century of the Christian era in Alexandria, the city that was then the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. Their founder, Carpocrates, was a philosopher who blended early Christian teachings with Gnostic ideas and practices dating back to ancient fertility cults. For him and his followers, salvation came not through the denial of the body, but through its complete liberation. They interpreted the scriptures in a radically different way, finding in the words of Christ a message of total liberation that included sexual liberation. But here is what makes this story even more disturbing. The Carpocratians were not ignorant outcasts or isolated heretics. Many were educated people, including philosophers, prosperous merchants, and even some members of the minor clergy who had been seduced by their doctrines. They possessed their own sacred texts, some of which were only recently discovered in archaeological excavations, revealing a complex and structured belief system. Their communities spread throughout the Roman Empire, from Alexandria to Gaul, operating in the shadows of official Christendom. What shocked the early church fathers most was not just the practice of ritual prostitution itself, but the elaborate theology that supported it. The Carpocratians taught that Jesus had revealed secret knowledge only to a few chosen disciples, knowledge that contradicted everything the church preached publicly. According to them, the human body was a divine temple that should be explored in all its capacities, and sexual union was not a sin, but a sacrament. They cited obscure passages from the Gospels and apocryphal letters to justify their practices, creating a counter-theology that threatened the very foundations of Christian morality. And if you think you know the history of Christianity, get ready to discover a side that was never told in schools or churches. Because the sect not only practiced sacred prostitution, but developed rituals so elaborate and controversial that when the details finally reached the ears of ecclesiastical authorities, they triggered one of the most brutal persecutions in early Christian history. Before we continue this disturbing journey through the darkest secrets of Christian history, click subscribe and hit the bell, because this channel is dedicated to bringing to light the stories that were buried for centuries, and you won't want to miss what comes next. To understand how a Christian sect came to practice sacred prostitution, we need to go back to the cultural melting pot that was Alexandria in the 2nd century. This Egyptian city, founded by Alexander the Great, was an explosive meeting point for cultures, religions, and philosophies. On the same streets where philosophers debated Plato, Egyptian priests performed millennia-old rituals to the gods Isis and Osiris, while early Christians tried to define exactly what it meant to follow the teachings of Jesus. It was in this environment of intellectual and spiritual effervescence that Carpocrates began to preach his revolutionary vision of Christianity. Carpocrates was no ordinary man. According to accounts from his contemporaries, he had studied with masters of various traditions, from Jewish rabbis to priests of the Greek Orphic mysteries. He possessed a vast library and spoke multiple languages. When he began teaching his interpretation of Christianity around 120 AD, he quickly attracted followers among Alexandrian intellectuals seeking a deeper spirituality than that offered by the nascent church. His son, Epiphanes, who died young but left influential writings, further developed his father's ideas, creating what would be known as the Carpocratian doctrine. The theology Carpocrates proposed was radically egalitarian for its time. He taught that all souls were equal before God and that human laws, including laws regarding property and marriage, were artificial constructs that imprisoned the divine spirit within each person. In his treatise on justice, Epiphanes argued that in God's original creation, everything was shared in common, including bodies. Private property, according to him, was a human invention that created inequality and suffering. This communal philosophy extended to sexual relations, which they viewed as a natural expression of the divine unity among all souls. But the Carpocratian doctrine went far beyond a simple philosophy of sharing. They developed a complex cosmology based on Gnostic ideas. According to their teaching, the material world was created not by the supreme and true God, but by inferior and ignorant angels, the archons. The human soul, a spark of the true God, was imprisoned in this imperfect material world. The only way to escape was through the total experience of all possibilities of material existence, including and especially sexual experiences. They believed that the soul needed to pass through all possible experiences before it could ascend back to the divine realm. This belief had profound practical implications. The Carpocratians taught that there was no act that was inherently sinful, because sin was a concept created by the archons to keep souls imprisoned in the cycle of reincarnation. Therefore, participating in ritual sexual acts was not a transgression, but spiritual liberation. They cited a peculiar interpretation of Paul's words about being above the law, and Jesus's words that nothing that enters a man defiles him. For them, true purity came not from avoiding certain actions, but from completely transcending the concept of good and evil through direct experience. This theology provided the philosophical justification for practices that would horrify church fathers for the next 1,000 years. The Carpocratian ceremonies took place away from prying eyes, usually in the private homes of wealthy members or in isolated caves outside the cities. The gatherings began at dusk and often extended until dawn. According to descriptions by Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers who wrote extensively about them, the rituals began with a communal banquet where everyone ate and drank together, without distinction of social class or gender. This meal was not simply social, but had deep sacramental significance, representing the primordial equality of all souls before the true God. After the banquet, the participants engaged in readings of sacred texts, but not the Gospels we know. The Carpocratians possessed their own scriptures, including alternative versions of the Gospel of Mark, containing secret passages about Jesus's nocturnal teachings. One of these texts, known as the Secret Gospel of Mark, was mentioned in a letter discovered in 1958 at the Mar Saba Monastery near Jerusalem. In this letter, Clement of Alexandria confirms the existence of an expanded version of Mark used in Alexandria, which contained mystical teachings on spiritual initiation through nocturnal rituals. What happened after the readings is where Carpocratian practice became truly controversial. According to their critics, after the scriptures were read and interpreted, the participants extinguished the lights and engaged in indiscriminate sexual acts, believing that through carnal union, they were experiencing original divine unity. They called this agape, the same Greek word Christians used for divine love. For the Carpocratians, physical love was inseparable from spiritual love, both being expressions of the divine spark, seeking reunification with its source. However, it is crucial to understand that, according to the Carpocratians themselves, these were not acts of uncontrolled debauchery, but carefully structured rituals with deep spiritual meaning. They believed that during sexual union, especially when practiced in a ritual context with spiritual intent, the barriers between souls dissolve temporarily, allowing a direct experience of divine unity. The women who participated in these rituals were seen not as prostitutes in the modern sense, but as priestesses who facilitated spiritual experience through their bodies. Some texts suggest there were specific women designated for this role, considered especially spiritually gifted. The most controversial practice, and the one that most horrified Christian critics, was what they called the communion of wives. The Carpocratians taught that just as all property should be shared, wives should also be shared among the members of the community. They argued that jealousy and possessiveness were products of humanity's fall from the original state of grace, and that overcoming these feelings through the practice of sexual sharing was an essential step in the spiritual journey. Married men offered their wives to other members of the sect, and women participated freely with multiple partners, all under the justification that they were practicing the true Christian communism that the original apostles had established, but applied not only to material possessions, but also to bodies. For the Carpocratians, the human body was not the enemy of the soul, but its essential vehicle for salvation. This view contrasted radically with the growing ascetic tendency in early Christianity, where fasting, celibacy, and mortification of the flesh were seen as paths to holiness. Carpocrates taught that this denial of the body was, in fact, a trap created by the archons, the evil angels who govern the material world. By making humans hate and deny their bodies, the archons ensured that souls would remain trapped in the cycle of reincarnation, never fully experiencing all the possibilities of material existence necessary for final liberation. The Carpocratian doctrine on reincarnation was central to their justification of sacred prostitution. They believed that every soul had to pass through every possible experience of material existence before it could ascend to the divine realm. If a soul did not experience something in one life, it would be forced to reincarnate again until all experiences were completed. Therefore, participating in all forms of sexual activity was not sin, but spiritual efficiency, a way to accelerate the process of liberation. They cited a peculiar interpretation of Luke 12:59, "You will not get out until you have paid the last penny," as evidence that the soul would remain trapped in matter until it paid for all due experiences. This theology created an inverted spiritual hierarchy within the sect. While the official church honored virgins and celibates as the holiest, the Carpocratians venerated those who had experienced the greatest number of sexual experiences as the most spiritually advanced. There were reports that they kept records of each member's experiences, and those who had completed more categories of experience were considered spiritual masters. This complete inversion of traditional Christian values was precisely what made the sect so threatening to the established church. Women in the Carpocratian sect occupied a unique and complex position. On one hand, the doctrine of the absolute equality of all souls meant that women were considered spiritually equal to men, something rare in the ancient world. Women could be spiritual teachers, interpret sacred texts, and lead rituals. On the other hand, the practice of sacred prostitution meant their bodies were seen as communal instruments of spiritual elevation. Some evidence suggests that certain women embraced this role enthusiastically, seeing it as a path of spiritual and social power within the community. Others may have been coerced by social or theological pressure, although historical records are ambiguous on this point. Carpocratian doctrine also included teachings on the generation of spiritual energy through the sexual act. They believed that sexual union, especially when practiced with ritual awareness and spiritual intent, generated a form of energy they called pneuma or spirit. This energy could be directed for spiritual purposes, including healing, prophetic visions, and even magic. There are accounts that the Carpocratians practiced forms of sexual magic, using the moment of climax as a point of maximum power to manifest spiritual intentions. This idea of sacred sexuality generating spiritual power was not unique to the Carpocratians, appearing in various mystical traditions, but its explicit integration into the Christian context was revolutionary and deeply disturbing to the emerging orthodoxy. During the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, the Carpocratian sect spread from its Alexandrian cradle to other parts of the Roman Empire with a speed that alarmed ecclesiastical authorities. Carpocratian communities were established in Rome, Antioch, Ephesus, and even in distant provinces like Gaul. This expansion was not accidental, but the result of active and strategic proselytism. The Carpocratians were masters at identifying individuals disillusioned with the moral rigidity of the official church, especially among the educated classes seeking a spirituality that was more intellectually sophisticated and less restrictive. The Carpocratian recruitment method was gradual and calculated. They did not immediately reveal their most controversial practices to potential converts. Initially, they presented an attractive philosophy of spiritual equality, secret knowledge, and personal liberation. New members were slowly introduced to the more esoteric teachings through a multi-level initiation system, similar to the ancient Greek mysteries. Only after demonstrating commitment and passing through various initiations would a member be exposed to the full sexual rituals. This structure of layered secrecy protected the sect from premature exposure and ensured that only the truly committed knew its most controversial aspects. The sect particularly attracted those who felt marginalized by conventional Roman society. Slaves were drawn by the message of absolute spiritual equality, where a slave could be considered spiritually superior to a Roman senator. Upper-class women, restricted by rigid Roman social expectations, found in the sect a form of expression and power denied to them elsewhere. Merchants and artisans, the empire's emerging middle class, were drawn by the philosophy of communion of goods, which created economically advantageous mutual support networks. This social diversity gave the sect a resilience and adaptability that made its eradication difficult. A fascinating aspect of Carpocratian expansion was their use of art and symbols. They created amulets, rings, and paintings with images of Jesus, Pythagoras, Plato, and other figures they venerated as bearers of divine knowledge. These objects served both as secret identifiers among members and as tools for proselytism. A Carpocratian ring, for example, could start a conversation leading to recruitment. Modern archaeologists have discovered some of these artifacts, revealing an artistic sophistication that indicates considerable financial resources and access to skilled artisans. The organizational structure of the sect also contributed to its expansion. Unlike the emerging Christian church, which was developing a centralized episcopal hierarchy, the Carpocratians operated in relatively independent cells. Each community had its own leaders and a certain autonomy in specific practices, provided they adhered to central theological principles. This decentralized structure made the sect harder to destroy, as there was no central leadership that could be captured or eliminated. When one community was discovered and persecuted, others continued to operate. This structural resilience allowed elements of Carpocratianism to survive in modified forms for centuries after the alleged eradication of the main sect. The reaction of the early church fathers to the Carpocratians was one of absolute horror and vehement condemnation. Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around 180 AD, in his monumental work Against Heresies, dedicated entire sections to exposing and refuting Carpocratian teachings. He described them as the worst of all heretics, accusing them of using Christ's name to justify the vilest immorality. For Irenaeus and other church fathers, the Carpocratians represented an existential threat not only to Christian morality, but to the very definition of what it meant to be Christian. Clement of Alexandria, writing a few decades later, provided more detailed descriptions of Carpocratian practices, though always through a lens of condemnation. In his works Stromata and Excerpta ex Theodoto, Clement argued that the Carpocratians had completely distorted Christ's teachings, turning the message of spiritual love into a license for carnal debauchery. He was particularly critical of their interpretation of Scripture, arguing that they deliberately misinterpreted passages to justify their carnal desires. Clement also expressed concern that the intellectual sophistication of the Carpocratians made their teachings dangerously persuasive to less educated Christians. But here is something many modern historians note. The descriptions by church critics may have been exaggerated or distorted. It was common practice in ancient religious polemics to accuse opponents of the most extreme transgressions possible, regardless of factual truth. Some contemporary scholars argue that while the Carpocratians certainly held unorthodox views on sexuality and property, the descriptions of indiscriminate orgies may have been polemical exaggerations. It is possible that their practices were more ritualized and controlled than their critics suggested, or that only extreme factions of the sect engaged in the most controversial practices. However, even taking into account possible polemical exaggeration, it is clear that the Carpocratians truly challenged sexual norms in ways that were radical for their time. And this challenge was not just practical, but theological. They were not simply behaving immorally while professing Christianity. They were arguing that their interpretation of Christianity was more authentic than that of the official church. This claim of alternative authenticity was perhaps more threatening than the sexual practices themselves, because it undermined the emerging church's authority to define Christian orthodoxy. The controversy over the Carpocratians also reveals broader tensions in early Christianity regarding the body, sexuality, and the nature of salvation. The church was in the process of defining its position on these crucial issues, and the existence of groups like the Carpocratians forced these debates to the forefront. By condemning the Carpocratians so vehemently, the Church Fathers were simultaneously establishing the boundaries of Christian sexual orthodoxy. In a sense, the Carpocratians served as a useful counterexample, a dark mirror against which the Church could define what it was not. And now, if you are fascinated by these hidden stories of Christian history that are never told in conventional churches, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel, because we have many more disturbing and forgotten revelations to share with you. As reports about the Carpocratians spread, the early church realized it faced not only a theological heresy, but a threat to the very moral structure it was trying to establish. Bishops began to coordinate a systematic response that combined intellectual refutation, social exclusion, and eventually, physical persecution. The first line of defense was polemical literature. Church fathers across the empire wrote extensive treatises exposing and refuting Carpocratian doctrines, ensuring that no Christian could claim ignorance regarding the heretical nature of the sect. Regional councils began to issue formal declarations condemning the Carpocratians and their practices. These declarations were not merely theoretical, but had concrete practical consequences. Christians discovered having associations with Carpocratians were excommunicated, cut off from church communion, and socially ostracized. In an era where religious identity was deeply intertwined with social and economic identity, excommunication could mean complete ruin. Merchants could lose customers, artisans could be expelled from their guilds, and entire families could be marginalized. The church also developed procedures to identify disguised Carpocratians. Candidates for baptism were interrogated extensively about their beliefs, specifically regarding issues of sexual morality and private property. Those who expressed views that sounded Carpocratian were rejected. Existing Christians suspected of Carpocratian sympathies were called before councils of elders for questioning. This vigilance created an atmosphere of suspicion and denunciation that, while effective in suppressing heresy, also created tensions within Christian communities. But the Church's response was not only repressive, it was also constructive. Recognizing that the Carpocratians attracted people with their promise of secret knowledge and profound spiritual experience, the Church began to develop its own mystical and ascetic traditions that offered alternative paths to intense spiritual experience. Monasticism, which began to flourish in the 3rd century, can be seen in part as an orthodox response to the search for transcendent spiritual experience that groups like the Carpocratians promised, but through denial rather than indulgence of the body. As Christianity gained political power, especially after the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century, the persecution of the Carpocratians intensified dramatically. What had been social exclusion and intellectual refutation became legal persecution backed by state power. Laws were enacted specifically against Carpocratian practices, with penalties ranging from property confiscation to execution. Known Carpocratian communities were raided, their members arrested, and their sacred texts burned. This eradication campaign was so thorough that almost everything we know about the Carpocratians today comes from the writings of their enemies, not their own voices. The few Carpocratian texts that survived were preserved accidentally, quoted in refutations, or hidden in monastery libraries by monks who kept them as examples of heresy to be avoided. What makes the Carpocratians particularly fascinating to modern historians are their connections to other religious and philosophical traditions of the ancient world. They did not emerge in a vacuum, but were part of a rich ecosystem of syncretic religious movements that flourished in the first centuries of the Common Era. Their practices of sacred prostitution echoed much older traditions from the Middle East, particularly the fertility cults associated with goddesses like Ishtar in Mesopotamia and Aphrodite in Corinth. In these ancient cults, sexual union with temple priestesses was seen as an act of communion with the divine, a way to participate in the creative energy of the goddess herself. The Carpocratians also shared significant elements with Gnosticism, the diverse religious movement that emphasized secret knowledge as the path to salvation. Like many Gnostic groups, the Carpocratians believed that the material world was the creation of an inferior or evil god, and that salvation came through esoteric knowledge that liberated the divine spark imprisoned in the body. However, while many Gnostics responded to this cosmology with extreme asceticism, rejecting the material world and the body as evil, the Carpocratians took the opposite direction, arguing that true liberation came through the total experience of the material. This divergence reveals a fascinating philosophical debate that permeated the ancient world, whether the path to transcending the material was through denial or indulgence. The Carpocratians argued that denying the body meant remaining trapped in a relationship of fear and aversion with the material, which was still a form of slavery. True liberation, they taught, came from experiencing the material so completely that one became indifferent to it, transcending it through saturation, rather than deprivation. This philosophy had parallels with certain schools of Cynic and Stoic philosophy that emphasized indifference to social conventions as a path to freedom. Carpocratian practices can also be compared with tantric traditions that were developing simultaneously in India. Tantra, particularly in its more esoteric forms, taught that sexual energy could be transformed into spiritual energy through specific ritual practices. Like the Carpocratians, some tantric practitioners engaged in sexual rituals as a form of worship and a path to enlightenment. Although there is no evidence of direct contact between Carpocratians and tantric practitioners, the similarity suggests that under certain philosophical and religious conditions, humans independently develop concepts of sacred sexuality as spiritual technology. Within Christianity itself, the Carpocratians were not the only group to develop unconventional sexual practices based on alternative interpretations of Scripture. There were reports of other Gnostic Christian groups with similar practices, including the Nicolaitans mentioned in the Book of Revelation and certain branches of the Ophites. Some scholars argue that these various sects represented a spectrum of religious experimentation in early Christianity before orthodoxy consolidated. They suggest that the Christianity we know today, with its emphasis on celibacy and chastity, was not inevitable, but the result of theological and political power struggles where certain interpretations triumphed and others were suppressed. The Carpocratians represent one of the paths not taken in the evolution of Christianity. For centuries, the Carpocratians existed primarily as villains in the texts of church fathers, their own voices silenced by the systematic destruction of their writing. But the 20th century brought remarkable archaeological discoveries that began to fill gaps in our knowledge. The most significant discovery was the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt in 1945, where Gnostic Christian texts were found hidden in clay jars, buried around the 4th century, likely to protect them from destruction during persecution. Although no specifically Carpocratian text was definitively identified in this collection, several texts share similar theological themes, giving us insights into the intellectual world from which the Carpocratians emerged. Particularly intriguing is a text called the Gospel of Philip, found at Nag Hammadi, which contains passages about the mystery of the bridal chamber, a ritual of spiritual union that some scholars speculate may have involved sexual elements. The text speaks of how the mystery of marriage is great and how through it the world would not exist. Although the exact meaning is debated, these passages suggest that at least some early Christian groups had concepts of sacred union rituals that went beyond conventional marriage. Whether these rituals were literally sexual or purely symbolic remains a matter of heated academic debate. Another crucial source is Clement of Alexandria's letter regarding the secret Gospel of Mark, discovered in 1958 by scholar Morton Smith at the Mar Saba Monastery. In this letter, Clement confirms the existence of an expanded version of the Gospel of Mark used in Alexandria, containing secret teachings of Jesus. He specifically mentions that the Carpocratians possessed and misinterpreted this secret gospel to justify their practices. Although the secret gospel itself has not been found, and the authenticity of Smith's letter is debated by some scholars. The letter suggests that there were alternative textual traditions in early Christianity that were subsequently suppressed. Physical archaeological evidence of the Carpocratians is extremely rare, precisely because they were so thoroughly persecuted and erased. However, some artifacts have been identified as possibly Carpocratian. Certain amulets and engraved gems from the late Roman period show syncretic images combining Christian symbols with figures from Greek philosophy, corresponding to descriptions of Carpocratian objects in ancient texts. A particular ring in the British Museum, dated to the 2nd or 3rd century, shows images of Jesus, Pythagoras, and Plato together, exactly the kind of syncretism that characterize Carpocratian thought. Perhaps most revealing are the silences and gaps in the historical record. There are periods and places where we know Christian communities existed, but details about their specific practices are strangely absent from official church records. Some historians speculate that these gaps may indicate communities with unorthodox practices that were deliberately erased from historical memory. Catacombs in Rome and Alexandria contain chambers with unusual iconography that does not fit easily into orthodox categories, raising questions about who created them and what rituals may have taken place there. This circumstantial evidence suggests that the diversity of early Christianity was even greater than surviving texts indicate, and that groups like the Carpocratians may have been more numerous and influential than official church history admits. Although the official church declared victory over the Carpocratians in the 4th century, elements of their doctrines persisted in underground and transformed ways throughout the medieval centuries. Historians have traced connections between Carpocratian ideas and later heretical movements that emerged in medieval Europe. The Bogomils in the Balkans, the Cathars in southern France, and the Brethren of the Free Spirit in Germany all shared certain theological elements with the Carpocratians, particularly the belief that spiritually advanced souls transcended conventional moral laws. Although there is no evidence of direct organizational continuity, the similarities suggest that certain theological ideas have a resilience of their own, resurfacing independently under similar conditions. The Cathars, who flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries in southern France, are particularly interesting in this context. Like the Carpocratians, they believed the material world was created by an evil god, and that salvation came through esoteric knowledge. However, unlike the Carpocratians, the Cathars were rigorously ascetic, rejecting sexuality and even marriage completely. But there are reports, mainly from their enemies during the Albigensian Crusade, that certain perfect Cathars practiced sexual libertinism, believing they had transcended moral laws. These reports are suspect, possibly were propaganda, but they echo similar accusations made against the Carpocratians 1,000 years earlier. During the Renaissance, when ancient texts were being rediscovered and studied, some humanists found descriptions of the Carpocratians in the writings of the Church Fathers. These descriptions influenced debates about the nature of morality, freedom, and the limits of religious interpretation. Some libertine thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries cited the Carpocratians as a historical precedent for their own critiques of conventional sexual morality. Although these references were often superficial or ill-informed, they kept the memory of the Carpocratians alive in European intellectual discourse. In the 19th century, with the rise of modern academic study of church history, scholars began to examine the Carpocratians with more nuance, attempting to separate historical fact from religious polemic. Some saw them as precursors to modern socialist movements due to their emphasis on communal property. Others saw them as early examples of sexual liberation and gender equality. These interpretations often say more about the concerns of modern interpreters than about the historical Carpocratians, but they demonstrate how ancient religious movements continue to be battlegrounds for contemporary debates. Today, in an era of religious pluralism and reassessment of historical orthodoxies, the Carpocratians are being reconsidered again. Some scholars argue that their suppression represents a loss of theological diversity that impoverished Christianity. Others see them as an example of how religious interpretations can be used to justify the transgression of important ethical norms. Contemporary neo-Gnostic groups sometimes claim a spiritual connection to the Carpocratians, although these claims are historically tenuous. What is clear is that the Carpocratians, despite having been banned and nearly erased from history, continue to fascinate and disturb, raising fundamental questions about the nature of spirituality, morality, and the limits of religious interpretation that remain relevant today. The story of the Carpocratians raises profound questions that resonate powerfully in our contemporary context. In an era of increasing religious pluralism and debates over sexual freedom, bodily autonomy, and the limits of religious tolerance, this obscure chapter of Christian history offers a fascinating and disturbing case study. How should we evaluate a religious movement that promoted radical equality and personal liberation, but through means that many would consider exploitative or abusive? This is not merely a historical question, but deeply relevant to contemporary debates about alternative religious communities. A particularly complex aspect is the question of consent and coercion within religious belief systems. The Carpocratians argued that their sexual practices were voluntary expressions of spiritual freedom. But in a system where participation in sexual rituals was presented as necessary for spiritual salvation, how voluntary was the participation really? This question echoes modern debates about consent in contexts of power imbalance, whether in religious institutions, workplaces, or other hierarchical structures. The story of the Carpocratians reminds us that ideologies of liberation can, paradoxically, create new forms of coercion. The suppression of the Carpocratians also raises questions about orthodoxy, heresy, and power. History is written by the victors, and in the case of the Carpocratians, almost everything we know comes from theirs. This should make us cautious about accepting historical characterizations uncritically. How many other voices and perspectives were silenced in the formation of the religious traditions we inherited? This question is relevant not only to Christian history, but to how we understand the formation of all religious and cultural traditions. Every orthodoxy was once one among many competing interpretations. Its status as truth was established through historical processes that involved power, politics, and often violence. On the other hand, the history of the Carpocratians also reminds us that not every claim of religious truth or spiritual freedom should be accepted without critical questioning. There are legitimate ethical reasons why societies establish limits on behavior, even when that behavior is religiously justified. The question is not whether limits should exist, but where they should be drawn and who has the authority to draw them. This tension between religious freedom and the protection of vulnerable individuals remains one of the most difficult challenges in modern pluralistic societies. Finally, the Carpocratians invite us to reflect on the relationship between body and spirit, material and divine. Most religious traditions develop some form of dualism, viewing body and spirit as distinct and often in conflict. The Carpocratians, in their own controversial way, challenge this dualism, arguing for an integration of the physical and spiritual. Although their specific practices are problematic, the question they raised remains: is a spirituality possible that fully honors human corporeality without falling into exploitation or abuse? This question continues to be debated in feminist theologies, queer theologies, and other contemporary currents of religious thought seeking to overcome traditional dualisms between body and spirit. In the late 4th century, after decades of systematic persecution backed by the power of the Christianized Roman Empire, the last known Carpocratian communities were dispersed or destroyed. Their sacred texts were burned, their leaders imprisoned or executed, and their members forced to renounce their beliefs or face severe consequences. Orthodoxy's victory seemed complete. The Christianity that emerged from this crucible of conflict was more uniform, more hierarchical, and more sexually restrictive than the chaotic diversity of interpretations that characterized the first centuries of the faith. The Carpocratians became a footnote in history, a cautionary example of heresy cited in sermons and theological texts, but their own voices were silenced. But were they really? History has a way of preserving even what is deliberately suppressed. Fragments of Carpocratian ideas resurfaced repeatedly throughout the centuries in new heretical movements, each adapting the core ideas to their own context. The belief that advanced souls transcend conventional moral laws, that salvation comes through experience rather than obedience, that the body is a temple rather than a prison. These ideas proved remarkably resilient. They speak to something deep in the human psyche, a desire for liberation that no amount of suppression can completely eradicate. For us today, the Carpocratians serve as a complex and disturbing mirror. They show us that the history of Christianity is far more diverse, strange, and controversial than we usually imagine. They remind us that concepts we consider fundamental to Christianity, such as clerical celibacy and restrictive sexual morality, were not inevitable, but the results of specific historical struggles. They challenge us to think critically about how religious traditions are formed, who has the power to define orthodoxy, and whose voices are silenced in the process. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Carpocratians is about the dangers of absolutism in any direction. The Carpocratians took certain philosophical and theological ideas to extreme conclusions, arguing that spiritual liberation justified the transgression of all moral norms. This position, while philosophically interesting, created real potential for exploitation and harm. On the other hand, the Orthodox Church's response, while understandable given the context, involved the violent suppression of theological diversity and the establishment of rigid controls over sexuality and thought that created their own harms over the centuries. True wisdom, perhaps, lies in recognizing that both complete liberation from norms and rigid adherence to orthodoxy can lead to problematic outcomes. As we conclude this journey through one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters of Christian history, we are left with more questions than answers, and perhaps that is appropriate. The story of the Carpocratians offers no simple moral lessons or comfortable conclusions. Instead, it invites us to a deeper reflection on the nature of religion, morality, power, and the eternal human tension between freedom and responsibility, between body and spirit, between the individual and the communal. These are debates that humanity has waged for millennia and will continue to wage for millennia to come. The Carpocratians, in their strangeness and transgression, remind us that these questions never have easy answers, and that human history is full of bold experiments, tragic failures, and the persistent search for meaning and transcendence, no matter how controversial the paths may be. If this journey through the forgotten shadows of Christian history touched you, share this video with someone who appreciates real and uncensored history, and continue exploring with us the mysteries that shaped our civilization in ways we never imagined.